I'm Cliff Ribner, and I want to talk to you today about what is considered by the inventors of those various federal regulatory agencies collateral damage. What it is, those agencies are set up, each one is set up with, and I'm talking about things like the FAA, which regulates everything about the airline industry, including to the extent that it performs services, and the FAA is one of the few that actually does. The aircraft directors, the people that tell the pilots what they can do so they don't crash into each other, that's the one service they actually perform. And that service could be performed by private companies. No service ever has to be performed by the government. Any real service can always be performed by private companies. And in that case, there's a whole bunch of different ways it could be done. The various airlines could get together contractually to set up a private version of that. And the problem with having the federal government do it is, like they supervise the air traffic controllers. The air traffic controllers don't have to work for the government. It could be done privately. In fact, in Europe, it's done that way. And one of the few things that the Europeans are doing correctly. And the problem with having the government do anything like that, it becomes a monopoly. And whenever a monopoly is there, it doesn't give a damn about its customers because it's bulletproof. If a private company was doing that, or even several, we can't even imagine the way it could be done because we're blocked from having it. But the airlines could create their own agencies of various, or companies of various kinds that even competed with each other for doing that particular service. And they would do it for profit, and they would save us money. We spend a fortune on all sorts of hidden fees in connection with the airline, and the whole experience of flying is miserable. The airports are hideous. And the whole thing is disgusting, and we have to deal with the TSA, which is supposedly going to protect us from terrorists. It doesn't allow. All it does is waste our time. If they want to protect us from, and the whole reason the TSA was set up the way it is because no one wanted to admit that there was a very specific group of people that were blowing up that were hijacking airlines. We knew who they were. They were specific. They were terrorists, and the reality is, our law enforcement people have the ability to identify those people. Like in Israel, they don't have all this stuff, and they are really in danger of having terrorists attack them. But what they do, it's called profiling. And they didn't want to have any profiling because then they might be accused of Islamophobia. That's really the whole reason for the whole TSA. It was Muslim terrorists that were attacking the airlines in various ways. And we're using airlines to do things like fly them into the World Trade Center and into the various places they might do that. Anyway, we don't need any of that. We don't need any of those federal regulatory agencies. To the extent they provide services, private companies could do it for a profit, and it would be cheaper ultimately because we pay for all of that stuff. Nothing is free. And when the government does it, it's really expensive. There's all sorts of hidden fees, and the airlines have to pay for it. Everything would be cheaper and better if it was all done by private companies. Now, in order to do that, we would have to repeal the antitrust laws. Otherwise, those airlines couldn't do the kind of contractual agreements that would be necessary to create something like the FAA or the air traffic controllers, or whatever version of that they came up with. They couldn't do it, but the antitrust laws don't do anything of value anyway. The reality is they're unconstitutional. And by the way, all of this stuff, all of these federal agencies and the antitrust laws are clearly unconstitutional. The federal government is not supposed to be and is not allowed under the Constitution to police the citizens. That's not its job. The states are supposed to police us, and the market. The market has its own rules. If companies don't deliver for their customers, they go out of business. The market is very tough, and it's not like the government, but it's got its own rules. There's two sets of rules that every business is subject to, and they don't need the additional set of rules set up by these agencies. One is the common law, and there's a whole bunch of common law torts that businesses if they commit them, then people that are actually injured by them can sue them. And what these agencies do is they police these businesses, all the businesses, in all different ways. without regard to whether it's actually hurting anyone at all. The SEC is a perfect example. They've created this notion of harm to the market, where people can be sued or even prosecuted for doing certain types of trading, and yet there's no one who can be identified who actually got harmed by what they did. But the SEC has been setting up all these rules. SEC is an inherently communist organization. They had no business existing. It was set up in 1933. It does nothing of value. The people it's supposed to be protecting are the most sophisticated people. They're people who have enough money to trade stocks. And the reason the SEC was set up in the first place was based on the lie that supposedly the Great Depression was caused by stock manipulation. It wasn't. Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz proved it in a book that came out in 1963. It wasn't caused by that at all. It was caused by the Fed. And the Fed is another one of these agencies that has no business existing. It was set up in 1913 in response to the panic of 1907, which occurred in 1906 and 1907, which was caused by Theodore Roosevelt threatening all the businesses in the country that he was going to go after them with the antitrust laws. And literally, you can't have panics of that kind unless the government is involved, threatening in various ways businesses, because the government has the power to destroy. It has the power to physically destroy any business, and it doesn't have any interest. It doesn't have any market power. There's no market. It's not selling anything. All it has is a monopoly of violence. And in our country, it's the states that are supposed to police the citizens and businesses under the state's common law. And the common law was created. It applies the Ten Commandments to real life situations. And it doesn't set up prohibitions. What it does is anyone who's actually harmed by the actions of a business, either negligent or intentional, it requires fault on the part of the business. But anyone who's harmed by a business in that manner, there are causes of action and they can sue them under the common law. That's one set of policing that all businesses are subject to. The other set is the rules of the market. The market is very tough discipline on businesses, and they compete among themselves so that as time goes by, what they produce gets better and cheaper because the competition is that tough. And there's never anything like a monopoly in reality unless the government creates it. Like the phone company, AT&T, it was created as a monopoly by the FCC. And for years most people today are too young to remember the ridiculous phones we had. And they were expensive. Long distance calls, it was like many dollars per minute. And everything was expensive. You couldn't carry the phone around with you like you can now with the cell phone. They had the technology for cell phones decades before it was permitted, but they wouldn't let them. And this is one of the consequences. That's what the main focus of what I want to talk about today is, not just how terrible these agencies are, but what they would consider collateral damage, the things we don't have, which we would have without the agency limits the products that we are allowed to buy. For example, since the 1980s, there's a company that makes flying cars. It's called the Mahler Company. And there are other companies that have come up with flying cars. They're not allowed to sell them to us because the FAA won't permit it. It's that simple. And the TVs we have today, at the prices, you can get a great big TV for just practically nothing. The technology for these TVs was available 50 years ago, but the FCC wouldn't let companies sell them. And basically, the presence of these agencies, what happens is each agency is given jurisdiction over a particular area of the economy, and its jurisdiction is total. So that the businesses that operate in that can't do anything without getting the approval of the agency. These agencies are literally the very definition of tyranny according to the Federalist 47, because they each have all three powers of government: legislative, executive, and judicial. Executive power, they write regulations. They call them regulations because they can't call them laws, but they have the power of law. There's hundreds of thousands of pages of regulations they produced, and according to our courts, wrongly, if you violate any of those, it's a crime. The reality is the federal government is only allowed to prosecute 3 crimes. Treason, which is a common law crime, but it's limited in Article 3 of the Constitution. It limits the definition of treason from what it was under the common law, because they didn't want they didn't want politicians accusing everyone of treason and doing terrible things to them. So, but the crimes are treason as limited by Article 3 of the Constitution. It requires 2 witnesses now. It's tough to convict someone of treason. And piracy, but only piracy on the high seas, and counterfeiting. And if you'll notice, piracy and counterfeiting are both commercial crimes. Piracy is illegally boarding a ship and stealing the stuff. That's a commercial crime. And so is counterfeiting. And yet the justification that the courts have been providing for claiming that all of these other federal crimes, and nobody even knows how many there are. They're endless. But they've been relying on one clause and one clause alone in the Constitution for that, all those crimes and all of those agencies. And the clause they've been relying on is the Interstate Commerce Clause, which you can see what it says. It doesn't permit any of that. And it wasn't about commerce as such, in our sense. What the courts have been pretending is, because it uses the word commerce, they've been imposing a Marxist interpretation of that clause. And of course, the last thing the founders were Marxists. They wanted businesses to thrive. That was the whole point of the pursuit of happiness that they fought the revolution for people to be able to have their business thrive, and America to be the richest and most powerful country in the world, because we were dedicated to individual liberty, where everyone could pursue their own trade or business, unhindered by anything except the laws of the market, which would determine whether they may actually got success. They're allowed to the pursuit of happiness, not the guarantee of it. Not guaranteed success, just guaranteed the right to compete. And that's what they fought the revolution for: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But the laws of the market and the common law, with the common law tort, so that when someone like Elizabeth Warren says, oh, without all these regulatory agencies telling the businesses what to do, it would be the Wild West with nothing governing them. Nothing could be further from the truth. Being subject to the laws of the market and the common law is very tough, and it's the way it's supposed to be in a free country. That's what being free is, when you answer only to the common law, when you're accused after the fact. In the first instance, you don't have to go to anyone for permission to do anything. But if you do wrong, then people that are harmed can come after you. Or if it's a crime, there are criminal laws you can break, like fraud can be enough of a bad fraud that it becomes a crime. But these things have to be proven, and there has to be someone accusing you, other than just the government just applying regulations for their own sake, which is what these agencies do. And these agencies, the justification for all of these agencies and all these crimes is the Commerce Clause. And we know for a fact that and the justification that they make is that the agency is going to make the market better or more safe. It's for our safety or for our health or to save us money, which is ridiculous. There's nothing in the Constitution that permits that. I'm showing you now the words of a case from the 19th century, Gibbons v. Ogden, right in its syllabus. John Marshall, who was the Chief Justice and one of the founders, and who knew exactly what the Interstate Commerce Clause purpose was, says that clause does not permit the federal government to do anything for health or safety or inspection laws. It doesn't permit any of that. So it's right there in his opinion. That's one of the reasons we know for certain that clause does not permit any of these agencies or any of these crimes. Also, the crimes which are permitted in the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, counterfeiting and piracy, those are commercial crimes. So they didn't need a clause that justified all these other crimes because they were commercial, when they've already got all the commercial crimes that are supposed to be there in the Constitution. They don't get to add to the Constitution, and that's what they've done with these agencies. They police us. Now, there's 2 things which are interfering with our market right now. It's these agencies, which do nothing of value. And by the way, we know that. We know that because they are all modeled on the Interstate Commerce Commission, which was the first one that policed us. It was set up in 1787. And 100 years after, almost 100 years after, the Carter administration looked into it and said it was absolutely worthless, did nothing of value, and it cost a fortune. And every one of these agencies is based on the Interstate Commerce Clause. Every one, or the Interstate Commerce Commission. Every one of them is structured exactly the way that commission was done. And they're all just as worthless as the Carter administration found was the case with all those other ones. Now, we also know all the agencies that were set up during the Roosevelt administration. In 1939, Roosevelt's Treasury Secretary testified before the Senate, said the whole New Deal, utterly worthless, didn't stop the Depression. In fact, it made it worse. And of course, it did. Businesses couldn't, the big problem with the Depression was there was unemployment. Well, how do you increase unemployment? By putting crushing burdens on businesses, discouraging them from employing anyone. That's what they did in the New Deal, and that's what all these things do. If we didn't have these agencies in this country, as we shouldn't, there would be all kinds of products that we don't even know about. What's happened is the only area of the economy that is actually growing and where there's innovation is things related to the internet. And there's two reasons for that. One is Section 2 is a statute that was set up to tell the federal government you can't regulate this at all, and people can't sue the people on the internet. It's called Section 230. Anyway, the internet is the only area where there's any innovation, new inventions constantly. We see them constantly. And it's because it's not a physical thing for the most part. And what's happened is, in addition to these agencies stopping stopping innovation and limiting our choices, just look at by the way, in terms of limiting choices, look at the cars. They all look the same. Take a look at the cars from the 1960s. They all look different. That tells you right there. And cars cost twice as much now as they did in the 1960s in constant dollars. And our choices are being limited. They all look the same. And we're paying twice as much for it. And that's the hidden cost of regulation. Anyway, the two things that are stopping us from having all the stuff we could have, and we are even though these agencies don't directly regulate us, and so we don't see them for the most part. Other than most people, the IRS is the only one they ever actually run into. The rest of them they don't see. But other parts of the economy see them. And there's no innovation, no growth in other parts of the economy other than the internet. And the reason that the internet and internet-related stuff, the reason the internet is able to innovate that way and produce products that are just amazing is because none of those agencies are allowed to regulate it, although Obama tried, but Trump got rid of those regulations. They were unconstitutional. But all these things are unconstitutional. Anyway, that and also the states tort law has been changed since the 1970s. What they've done is they've made anything that is capable of physical injury, basically it's impossible for people to put it on the market. Anything that could produce a physical injury of any kind, however done, even if it's misused, liability can be imposed. It's called strict liability in tort. This was an idea that Marxist law professors came up with, and they got all the states to adopt it. It's called, the nice word for it is product liability. But what it does is it makes anyone who has any physical product at risk that the product will be misused by someone, or it's stolen and then harmed unto some third party. It doesn't require any fault on the part of the manufacturer and what it does is it imposes liability on everyone involved in producing or selling the product. So once it enters what's called the stream of commerce, anyone involved in the stream of commerce can get sued for the product. So everyone is at risk. And you see this like with these lawsuits about opiates or other drugs where it's basically putting certain businesses out of business now. Walgreens is having to shut thousands of stores for selling prescription drugs that were perfectly legal. It's crazy. But these state laws have expanded liability under the tort law to permit no fault liability for anyone who produces or anyone who's involved in the production or sale of any physical product. And you never know how it's going to be used. Because it's no fault, it violates the basic rule that always applied to tort law, because tort law involved punishing people who were at least negligently at fault when they harmed someone else. It was an application of the Ten Commandments. And the Ten Commandments looks at individual responsibility, not collective responsibility. And only if you're actually at fault can liability be imposed on you under traditional tort law. That was what was changed in the 1970s, where these Marxist law professors came up with various theories for this no-fault liability on the part of any defendant involved in the stream of commerce in producing any physical product which ended up harming someone, even if that person harmed it himself. It was crazy. Anyway, those two things are what are preventing us from having all sorts of things that we don't even know exist. The things we know exist that we can't have are things like flying cars, which we should be able to have, and nice airports. All these things, and the reason we don't have them is because of those agencies which are unconstitutional, as proven by that opinion by Chief Justice Marshall, and also in the Federalist 42, James Madison, who wrote was principal author of the Constitution, said the purpose of those things is not for that at all. It was for the federal government to police the states, not the citizens or businesses, but the states, to prevent the states from harming out-of-state businesses. That's the purpose of the clause. And they've turned the whole thing on its head by using that clause to police as the constitutional justification for all these crimes that we are subject to and are subject to being accused of, so that the federal government's in a position now where they have to pick and choose which crimes to actually prosecute, because people commit crimes all the time, because any violation of those regulations is a crime. And even the regulations themselves are unconstitutional. The only people that are allowed to write laws in our country is Congress, and these things are written by bureaucrats in the dead of night. The whole procedure for adopting them, it turns the legislative process on its head, and they're not laws. That's why they call them regulations. But they're treated like laws, and violating them is a crime, even though the Constitution specifies all the crimes the federal government's allowed to prosecute. And again, the federal government is not supposed to be in the business of policing us, and it doesn't do any good to us when it does. And that was proven by the Carter administration when it looked at the Interstate Commerce Commission, and by Treasury Secretary Morgenthau when he described what all the legislation from the New Deal had done. But most of the harm is unseen, because you don't see the products that you never are allowed to buy. You don't see the places that would be better. You don't see prices that would be lower in the absence of these things. And you can't, for example, just the FDA. It's totally unconstitutional, created in 1906. The whole regulation of drugs by the federal government creates black markets for the drugs that are, things like recreational drugs they don't want you to buy, which means that you have to buy them from crooks if you're going to buy them. And just a rotten market for all the regular drugs, where there's only a few drug companies that can deal with the expense and the difficulty of dealing with all these regulatory agencies, because regulatory agencies always operate under the precautionary principle. Once one is put in power of an area of the economy, they never want to be accused of letting something happen that hurts someone. So the default answer by an agency is not to permit it. And that's what they do. They stop things from happening. Their permission has to be obtained in order for anything to be done. Like right now, even though it's great that the federal government is shut down, in reality, it's not, because they have forced us into a situation where businesses have to get permission to do things or they can't function. And they have to get the permission of these agencies. They're not supposed to have to do that at all, but that's the way it is right now. The agencies have made themselves a necessity. Anyway, I'm Cliff Ribner, and if you like this video, please so indicate and tell other people about it, and about my website, cliffordribner.com. And read my book, Freedom's Last Stand. Thank you.